We're so glad you could join us today for a walk in the garden. I'm Penny Lewis, Executive Director of the Ecological Landscape Alliance. Welcome to gardeners across the United States and to our international guests. As we continue to cope with the challenges of the pandemic, we hope that these virtual garden walks will add a bit of beauty to your day and inspire you to visit, create, and enjoy gardens in your area. As this is the final presentation in a Walk in the Garden series, we hope that you'll explore the many other inspiring and educational opportunities on our website, www.ecolandscaping.org. Be sure to register early if you're interested in the Advanced Design Workshop class with Patrick Kalina on August 5th or August 12th, as these limited attendance events are sure to sell out early. Today I would like to introduce Heather Holm, whose garden walk invites us to explore specialist bees. Heather Holm is an award-winning author and speaker, spending much of her time passionately educating audiences about the fascinating world of native plants, native bees, and other pollinators. Heather's expertise includes the interactions between native bees and native plants, and the natural history and biology of native bees in the upper Midwest and Northeast. Heather currently lives in Minnesota with her husband, where she writes, designs, assists with conservation projects, and native bee research. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you, Penny. Thanks for everyone tuning in today. Just want to give a special shout out to the Ecological Landscape Alliance for inviting me to give this presentation today. And as Penny said, I will be talking about specialist bees. And just for those of you tuning in from other parts of the country, outside of the Midwest, Northeast, or Eastern United States, I just wanted to let you know that I'll be talking primarily about bee and plant species in those ecoregions, but hopefully that you'll get some good information from the content that you can apply to the region that you live in. So without further ado, I'll get started. Just as a quick overview of the presentation today, I'm going to be talking about what it means to be a specialist bee. There's a number of different definitions. I'll get into detail about that and show some examples. Some of our specialist bees have very fascinating pollen collection adaptations. And so I'll be featuring a few of those as we go through the presentation. And then the second part of the presentation will be on native plants through the season. So I'll be featuring native plants that support specialists, starting in the spring and ending in autumn. And that's a good, once I get into talking about the plants in autumn, that's a good reminder for the audience to make sure you've typed in any questions that you have before we end the webinar today. So bees are essentially hairy wasps. They have branched off from their wasp cousins and have become largely vegetarian. So most of their food they derive from plants from the flowers, the plant's flowers, and the flowers are producing pollen, nectar, and I'm also going to talk about an example of a flowering plant that produces floral oils instead of nectar. So these are the provisions that female bees in particular are interested in collecting to bring back to their nest to feed their offspring. So it's just the female bees, and I actually took this photo here of this female longhorn bee about an hour ago, and she's busy collecting pollen from a black-eyed Susan flower. You can see she has very long hairs on her hind legs. I often call them chaps, and she's able to collect a significant amount of pollen and carry it back to her nest on these pollen collecting structures. So the pollen and nectar are providing different nutrients, and when the female bee combines these two components together in the nest, it provides all the nutritional needs for the bee larva to feed upon. And so we have this large diversity of native bees in North America, approximately 4,000 species. And each bee and maybe each bee genus has their own way to collect pollen. So this is just an overview of things. If you're an avid bee watcher, you can start to figure out whether or not, first of all, if the bee is actually collecting pollen, that would indicate that it's a female rather than a male. And also the structures or ways that they're collecting pollen. So bumblebees and honeybees are the only types of bees in North America that have a pollen basket. So you can see in that left image, the female worker bumblebee is packed pollen mixed with nectar on her hind tibia in this mass, like I call them the orange footballs. And most other bees have scopa, and that's located on the hind leg. It could be the lower part of the hind leg where they have lengthier hairs to collect and carry pollen. Some bees also have hairs on the side of their thorax or even the side of their abdomen. So that metallic green sweat bee featured on the right, you can see she's not only collecting it on the hind leg, but on other parts of her abdomen. And then out of the number of families that we have in North America, family of bees, the Megachilidae family, the leafcutter bee family, collect pollen on the bottom of their abdomen. And so they have rows of hairs on each sternite on the underside of their abdomen for collecting pollen. And then we have a few bees that don't collect pollen at all. And one of those is the yellow-faced or masked bee. In the picture on the right, you can see they resemble wasps. They don't have any lengthy hairs to collect pollen externally. So they instead chew on the pollen and consume the nectar, store it in their crop, and then regurgitate those two materials once they get back to their nest. And then we also have bees that have no interest or need to collect pollen. And those include cuckoo bumblebees, and cuckoo bumblebees are social parasites. They will invade the nests of other bumblebees, take over the nest, killing the queen, and then convince the workers inside that nest to start rearing their offspring. So that picture of the lemon cuckoo bumblebee, you can see she has long hairs on her hind legs, but she will only be visiting flowers for nectar, for calories, and has no purpose or need to collect pollen to bring it back to her nest. And then we also have a number of cuckoo bees that generally invade the nests of solitary bees. And this nomada species that I have pictured here, you can see they also, like the masked bees, are relatively hairless, lack any kind of pollen collecting structures. Many folks observing pollinators would mistake them for a wasp in many cases. And so they're invading the nests of other bees, slipping inside while the host bee is away, laying their egg inside the nest and then leaving. So they're putting all of the care and rearing for another bee to do for them. So they don't have any need to collect pollen themselves. So of the number of 4,000 species of bees that we have in North America, many are polylectic, so meaning that they will collect pollen from a very wide range of plants. For example, our social bees, which make up approximately 10% of native bees, including bumblebees, they don't really have specialized plants or specific plants that they collect pollen from. Because they are producing multiple generations throughout the growing season, they're foraging from spring through fall, they're going to visit a wide variety of plants for pollen and nectar. And so they haven't developed any sort of specializations. They get the term generalist bees applied to them, but more recent research is indicating that each bumblebee species seems to have its preferences of what particular plants it will collect pollen from. So there's more nuance the more that we're learning about the specific interactions between some of our social bees and native plants. So approximately 75% of bees in the eastern United States are polylectic. And for polylectic bees, it really comes down to a number of factors of what particular plants they may choose to visit. Some of those things could include flowering phenology. So for our social bees, as I mentioned, such as bumblebees, they are foraging throughout the growing season in all months while plants are blooming. But for some of our solitary bees, they have a very narrow window of time that they would be foraging. So the plants that they are accessing would overlap or be flowering when they're active as adults and provisioning nests. So the flower form and flowering phenology will start to dictate what particular plants they may visit. And also their physical size and abilities. That previous slide showed the bumblebee manipulating a blue lobelia flower. So it's a large bee. It has quite a bit of strength to be able to push open the flower in order to gain access inside to perhaps sip on nectar. Some of our smaller bees may not have those abilities. They may have shorter tongues. So that will start to limit the types of bees, even if the bee is polylectic, what particular plants they may be able to visit. So the approximately 25% of native bees in eastern United States are oligolectic or monolectic or specialists. And before I get any further, and I provided Penny with some links and resources that she will have for you if you're tuning in. But I just wanted to mention the primary person, who is Jared Fowler, who's doing much of the specialist bee research currently. And I created this chart from his website to show the 6 different bee families that are including specialists. And you can see 52% are from the Andrenidae family, primarily bees in the genus Andrena. A lot of those are specialists, and I'll be featuring some of those. Apidae, which includes bumblebees, honeybees, make up 18% or 32 species. Callididae, which includes Callides as well as the yellow-faced or mass bees I mentioned earlier, only 18 species. Sweat bees, 4% of sweat bees are specialists. 11% of the leafcutter bees are specialists, and the 5% from the Melitidae family, which are generally pretty uncommon and rare bees, but I'll be talking about one of those later in the presentation. So oligolecty is one form of specialization, and it means that the females are only collecting pollen from one host plant family. And in many cases, for our upper Midwestern and Northeastern bees, that can mean, for example, the Asteraceae family. And for those of you tuning in, you're probably very familiar with how diverse the Asteraceae family is. So even though they're oligolectic, they are seeking out pollen from a pretty wide variety of plants within that family. And this picture I took in a little corner lot restoration last summer, and this female bee was visiting Monarda fistulosa, and I got quite excited. This bee, I thought I was photographing a new species I had never seen before, and I didn't make the connection later that it was actually a female squash bee. And what tricked me was I forgot that even though the female bees only collect pollen from squash flowers, they may visit a variety of plants for nectar. And so that's something to consider if you're out looking for specialist bees. The males will be visiting a wide variety of plants for nectar, and the females aren't necessarily always going to be found on the host plant collecting pollen. So they, like the larvae, they need a broad supply of nutritional needs coming from different flower nectars. And monolecty is the very narrow specialization in native bees. So females that are monolectic will only be collecting pollen from one host plant genus. So the example I have here is a dogwood specialist, the short-haired dogwood mining bee. She can be only found on dogwood flowers collecting dogwood pollen. So there are a number of hypotheses about how do these specialists, whether they're polylectic or monolectic, how do these bees find their host plants? Well, one theory is as the larva is consuming the pollen, they are also, through olfactory means, smelling the floral scents of the pollen or the floral odors. And that becomes, when they become adults, that becomes their cue as to which plants the females should be actively searching pollen from. What is unknown is whether they also have built-in visual floral cues that are part of the attractant, but that's still being still being determined, and I'm sure a lot more research will be finding out some other ways that these specialists are finding plants. The one study in 2008 found they had, this was a European study, but they tried to provide females with non-host pollen, and what happened was the females just simply stopped nesting. So if they weren't being provided with their host pollen, they ceased nesting activities. But what was curious about this particular study is even though they successfully reared males on the non-host pollen, they still found the males out in the landscape patrolling for females near the host plants. So how those males determined being fed non-host pollen and having no association perhaps with those floral odors, they were still able to find the right host plants when they're out looking for a mate. So there are a number of advantages and disadvantages if you were a oligolectic or monolectic bee or specialist bee. One advantage from the plant's point of view, it means that if you have a specialist bee, you're going to have a bee that's demonstrating floral constancy. They're only going to be visiting that particular plant for pollen, so they weren't potentially gumming up the works with bringing in different kinds of pollen. So that can lead to better pollination. It also is much easier for a bee if the host plant is present, that it makes foraging really easy. They have one-stop shop, no guesswork. All they have to do is hopefully have the right host plants nearby where they are nesting. And back to the males, so male behavior, and this is the case for both polylectic and specialist bees. Males, in many cases, will patrol particular flowering plants, knowing that they will hopefully find a female there. And in the case of the specialists, it's a good place to look. For example, this male Calides latitartus, I often find them perched around the leaves of the host plant, which is physalis or ground cherry. And they'll be hanging out on the leaves like my image shows on the left, waiting for their opportunity for the female to come visit the flower and have an opportunity to mate with the female. Same with this Caliopsis nebraskensis, which is a verbena specialist. This is a male perched out, almost setting up a territory, looking around, waiting for the females to come visit the verbena flowers. So it takes a lot of guesswork out for both the male and females because they all know where the rendezvous point will be. So obviously there's some disadvantages to being a specialist. A narrow diet, if they're only consuming pollen from one type of plant, does that plant provide all the nutritional needs that the bee larva needs? And of course, the big one that are concerned about today is their susceptibility to habitat loss, fragmentation, climate change. So these host plants may be blooming for a shorter period of time, or climate change may result in a mismatch of when the plant flowers and when the specialist emerges. So many of our specialists are ground nesting. They may be taking phenological cues from day length or soil temperatures. The plants may be flowering differently as we go forward with climate change. So specialist bees are at high risk of being extirpated from an area with all of these factors that I've mentioned. So every bee has its different, whether it's a specialist or generalist, has different pollen collecting adaptations. That longhorn bee in my first slide visiting the black-eyed Susans that I took this morning, she was circling around the black-eyed Susan flowers and rubbing her hind legs on the anthers that were producing pollen and getting those chaps just covered in pollen. Similarly, if you only have one particular plant and if you're a specialist that you visit, you may have developed some adaptations to really efficiently and effectively collect the pollen. And these are a few examples from a 2017 study. Osmia, several species in the Osmia or mason bee genus. Researchers found that, and this is a type of bee that is in the leafcutter bee family, so it's collecting pollen on the bottom of the abdomen. And one pollen collection adaptation they found was that the bee would rapidly pat up and down in an up and down motion on top of the flower where the pollen was being produced. And pretty crazy, 460 pats per minute. So a very high frequency technique that they were using to collect pollen. Similarly, they found longhorn bees in the Melissoides and Sphaster genus also tapping the underside of their abdomen to collect pollen from the flowers, not as high a frequency as the Osmia. So they would do that and collect it on dense hairs on the bottom of their abdomen, and then later those females would be grooming that pollen to their hind legs onto their pollen collecting structures. Another example of adaptation for pollen collection. So this is the Caliopsis nebraskensis, small mining bee that specializes on plants in the verbena genus. And verbena flowers generally have fairly long flower corollas. The anthers are located inside the flower corolla. So what the females do is they will insert their forelegs into the flower corolla and then rake out the pollen from their forelegs, which have curled bristles. And so they're inserting their legs inside, raking it out, and once they have it, it actually will collect, because you can see this female's positioning. The pollen will collect on the bottom of her abdomen as she's raking it out, and then she will later transfer it onto her hind legs where she's packing and carrying it back to her nest. So I'm going to go through some native plants that are used by specialist bees. You can see from my collage of images here, some are quite commonly used in our native plant landscapes and gardens. I'll be talking about some of the more unusual ones, specifically for the reasons that I think you folks that are listening can help recommend to our native plant growers what plants they may not be growing that support specialists. And so we can get more of these plants being produced and into gardens and landscapes. So I'm going to start off with spring. The first plant that, particularly where I live in the upper Midwest, that blooms usually first, or one of the first plants to bloom, are the willows. And our Midwestern and Eastern North American willows have separate male and female plants, where all willows do. But where I was going with that is, which is unusual, they are mostly insect pollinated, or all insect pollinated, even though they have separate male and female plants. And so the female plants are producing quite a bit of nectar for visiting insects, and then of course the male plants are producing the pollen. So it's the visitation between these two male and female plants that will result in pollination. Now, willows, I'm sure some of you are thinking, where would I grow a willow? Yes, they can be a challenging plant because many of them like fairly wet conditions. They can spread rather quickly, not well behaved. Some that I recommend that people start with are, for example, pussy willow, and where I live in the Midwest, prairie willow is also a more well-behaved willow that can fit into smaller gardens or landscapes. And willows support a large number of bees in the spring. Some of the first bumblebee species, such as this two-spotted bumblebee, the queens coming out of hibernation, will utilize willow as a nutrient source. And then number of bees, 14 monolectic specialists, so 14 different species. The females only collect pollen from willow flowers. And the other thing I like to point out, especially regarding the nutritional value, willow has been found to have a very high protein content in its pollen. So some folks are probably familiar with social media memes talking about the value of dandelions in the spring for bees. I always like to counter that with willows. Willows are much more nutritionally significant, and in addition to that are supporting 14 different specialists. These are two willow of the monolectic willow specialists. They just happen to both have red abdomens. One of these two species can have a black abdomen as well. So it really depends on the region and a number of other factors. So I photographed these in a local park, which is primarily a sandy site. Both of these species like to nest in compacted sand. Generally a site that's sparsely vegetated. The females will ideally have a nesting site that's very close to a willow population. So this park has a creek and wetland area in the middle, and then some upland sites that are prairie remnants and restored prairies that are quite sandy. So it's an ideal place for this specialist. It provides the right soil type for nesting, and the host plant is located nearby. One thing to remember is, native bees come in all different sizes, and some especially particularly the small native bees really can't fly very far. So if you are a specialist, you need to have an ideal nesting location that's located sometimes within 100 yards or maybe 300 yards from where you are nesting. And that can also pose some challenges or maybe a disadvantage for specialist bees, depending on how the landscape is potentially fragmented or there's habitat loss. Okay, I could talk probably for the whole presentation on spring woodland wildflowers. And for those of you tuning in from the eastern US, some that I'm not going to mention but are important are ones such as spring beauty, violets, trout lily. All of those spring blooming woodland wildflowers support specialists. The one I did want to mention for woodland wildflowers is the hydrophyllum or water leaf plants. They are extremely beautiful. Some folks find them quite aggressive depending on the soil type that they're growing them in, but like all native landscapes, things can be aggressive for a short period of time, or it can be dependent on planting density and other factors. And for me, in my own experience, I don't find water leaf overly aggressive, and I think its benefits outweigh any sort of concerns about that. So water leaf provides both nectar and pollen for a variety of different insects, and it has just one monolectic specialist, a bee in the mining bee or Andrena genus. And this mining bee is fairly tiny compared to the majority of other Andrena species. And here's the photo. What I'm trying to show in the photo here is she has a very different pollen collection strategy. And so a bee visiting a plant, you'll start to maybe parse out, is this bee visiting the plant for nectar, or is the bee visiting the plant for pollen? And you can see she's hanging out on the end of the filament, grasping onto the filament, chewing on the anthers and collecting the pollen. Whereas the bumblebee is clearly sticking her face inside of the flower and consuming nectar. So starting to look at these foraging behaviors will help you determine what the bee may be doing or collecting from the flower. Where I live in the upper Midwest, the other reason why water leaf is so important is it provides nectar for rusty patch bumblebee gines, which is, for those of you who don't know that are listening, is our only endangered bumblebee species. So for that reason, I encourage many people where I live to plant hydrophyllum. The other spring woodland wildflower I want to feature is the wild geranium, or Geranium maculatum. This is a beautiful plant, also can seed if you have a lot of bare spaces in your shade garden, but in a densely planted, diverse garden, it's very well behaved. I think it's one of the most beautiful spring blooming plants in my garden. I look forward to the third week of May when my garden is in full bloom with wild geranium. It also can attract a wide variety of pollinating insects, not just bees, and these are just some examples I've put on the slide. And also bees that are particularly interested in pollen, such as the spring active orchard mason bees. I regularly find them collecting wild geranium pollen. And wild geranium, like the hydrophyllum, has one monolectic specialist, also in the same genus, Andrena. And I wish I could show you a video today because she's hilarious to watch. She actually, the picture doesn't show what she actually does. She usually collects the pollen upside down. So she'll bury her head in the bottom of the flower, and then with her abdomen hanging up in the air, will rub the anthers producing the pollen with her hind legs. So it's a pretty unique pollen collection strategy that she has. Moving on to late spring, many of the plants in the carrot family are excellent at attracting a wide diversity of flower visiting insects, simply because they have plants in compound umbels with very shallow flowers. And so it doesn't matter if you're a small bee with a short tongue or a big burly bumblebee, any and all insects can access the pollen and nectar generally from carrot plants in the carrot family. Golden Alexander's is a pretty versatile plant. We grow it here in savannas where I live. It thrives in full sun and mesic soils and prairies, and it's fairly shade tolerant as well. And it attracts a wide diversity of bees. Where I live, this is generally the first plant I will see yellow-faced or masked bees visiting in the spring after emergence. So I often relate the flowering of particular plants for when I may start to see a particular bee in a particular genus. And because the flowers are accessible and they will attract a wide diversity of insects, including many beneficial wasps, such as this solitary predatory wasp that I have pictured here. And Zizia has one specialist. I have a question mark after oligolectic because it's still being figured out whether or not they are simply a Zizia specialist or they may also be collecting pollen from some other plants in the carrot family. And to give you an example, my corner lot restoration in my neighborhood has both large populations of Zizia as well as this clustered black snake root plant, which is also in the carrot family. And this spring, I found more of the Andrena ziziae visiting the clustered black snake root than I did the Zizia at the site. But my question, again, looking back at what is the bee actually doing while she's visiting the flower? Well, here she's clearly sipping on nectar. So you can't assume if a specialist is visiting a particular plant that may fit into the specialization host plant category that she actually is collecting the pollen from that plant. Obviously, pollen analysis would only give you the answer about that. But I want to put it out there that we need people looking for these interactions and associations so we can learn more about Andrena ziziae, for example, and what other plants the females may be collecting pollen from. All right, moving on, I'm not featuring a ton of woody plants, but I want to mention that there are several woody plants that support specialists. Vaccinium, for example, the blueberries, A number of other ericaceous plants support specialists. I just am featuring a few today, but the resources that I'm providing at the end of the presentation will give you a complete list of host plants and specialists. So hopefully you can start to learn more about the woody plants in the particular region that you live in that may support specialists. But I thought I'd mention some that have a broad, that occur broadly throughout North America. And one of those plants is dogwoods, or plants in the Cornus genus. And where I live, there's a wide range of dogwoods to choose from for any situation, whether it's a wetland edge, moist site, dry upland site, woodland understory. We have a dogwood for pretty much any situation. And I featured this bee earlier in another photo, but it's one of 4 monolectic specialists of dogwood. And I want to mention, I was talking to Penny before we started the webinar, and I have maybe a ½ acre to 3/4 acre suburban lot. And I have photographed many, many specialists just in my own landscape. So you don't have to necessarily go to rare remnant plant communities to find some of these specialists. Some of them are quite common. It really comes down to planting the plants that they depend on. Okay, here's an oddball plant that I wanted to incorporate in the presentation. And it's one that I don't think a lot of native plant growers are currently scrambling to grow, but I've been putting out the suggestions that maybe they should consider growing it because it supports 4 different specialists. And I have a funny story, and I think I have time to tell it, and hopefully my neighbor doesn't feel more badly than she already does. But this corner lot restoration we have in her neighborhood, she asked if she could dig out some black-eyed Susans that were seeding into the mulch path, and I said, absolutely. She followed up with an email to tell me that she had weeded out the Chinese lantern plants while she had been digging out the black-eyed Susans. And of course, they weren't Chinese lantern plants. They were physalis that I was letting grow in the path simply because I knew they would support a specialist. And this is a fairly young restoration. And she felt really badly, but fortunately I found many other physalis growing in the restoration, so I could assure her that she didn't put a dent in the population. So physalis belong to the solanaceous or tomato nightshade family. The flowers are nectarless and require buzz pollination. So a number of different native bees have the ability to sonicate or buzz pollinate flowers. And two of the specialists that I have featured here, one is the Calides latetarsus, which was the previous photo I showed of the male staking out his territory near the physalis flowers to find a female. And this other one is nesting at the same site as those willow specialists in a sandy prairie, and it belongs to the Perdita or fairy bee genus. They're extremely tiny. They like to nest in bare sand, and because of their physical size, likely are nesting within 100 yards or less of their host plant in that particular situation. I have yet to find physalis growing at this site, so it's curious to me where they may be collecting their pollen from. Okay, this is a Midwestern specialist, but I could not include it in the presentation just because they're so interesting. It's also a fairy bee or a bee in the Perdita genus, and extremely tiny. And you can see some of the bees in the Perdita genus are very pale in coloration, almost albino-like. And this particular species is a specialist of dahlia. So dahlia generally grows from the upper Midwest into Texas and parts of the Southwest. And dahlia not only supports this particular specialist, but as well as others in the Calides genus or cellophane bee genus. So you can see what she's doing. She's about to chew on the anthers with her mandibles, and then probably through some transfer from the pollen that she extracts from the anthers, she'll be transferring it onto her hind leg. And she's got quite a pollen mass packed on her hind leg already. So she's probably about to go back to her nest because she is going to be otherwise weighted down with too much pollen. All right, moving out into midsummer, and where I live right now, some of the vervains are just starting to bloom. Common species that we grow here are the Verbena stricta, which likes wetter sites, often find it on wetland edges, and it can be an appropriate plant to use in larger rain gardens, but it gets quite tall, so a very small rain garden, it probably wouldn't be appropriate. The Verbena I have featured here is the hoary vervain, and it tends to like dry, well-drained soils, compacted soils. So in degraded prairies, it will grow on the edges of footpaths, for example, or where the soil has been heavily compacted. Going back to my little local park, I found the specialist there, and again, the right conditions of the well-drained sandy soil where this particular bee nests, and an abundant population of vervain that the females can collect pollen from. So it's no mystery that the specialists are going to be looking for similar nesting conditions in which their host plants grow. Okay, here's a really fascinating plant and supports some fairly rare specialist species, plants in the Lizomachia genus. So I'm sure some of you will be nodding your heads because when you mention loosestrife to folks, they immediately think of purple loosestrife, an invasive species. But we have this beautiful array of different native loosestrifes. Many of them have yellow flowers. I have Lizomachia terrestris, or swamp candles, featured here, as well as the fringed and whorled loosestrife. And all are very much garden worthy. They tend to like more moist soils, but can tolerate partial shade. In my corner lot restoration, the fringe loosestrife is now blooming from being a seeding 2 years ago. So it doesn't take long even from seed to establish many of our native loosestrifes, and they're absolutely beautiful. And what's really fascinating about these flowers, they're actually nectarless, but the flowers produce floral oils. So they have oil secreting glands on the corolla, as well as the filaments, as you can see in this close-up photo that I took of a flower in my rain garden the other day. And the oil just sort of seeps out of these glands and bubbles up. And this is what the specialist, Macropus nuda, is interested in, as well as the pollen. So not only is it a specialist of the flower pollen, but it also is collecting the floral oils produced by native loosestrife flowers. So this picture by Joel Gardner shows that the female has sort of bristles or pollen collecting hairs, oil collecting hairs on her forelegs, and she will brush those forelegs over the glands or the bubbles of oil being produced on the flower, and simultaneously collecting the pollen. So she's doing double duty at once when she visits the flowers. So this particular native bee will incorporate the oil right into the pollen provisions. She will also collect it separately in some cases to use as a lining. She nests in the ground, so the oil likely provides some waterproofing for the nest in the ground, so that the provisions don't spoil. So pretty fascinating specialization. The bees in the Macropus genus are generally pretty uncommon to rare. I've been planting a number of loosestrifes for the last 8 to 10 years. I'm still looking for Macropus, so hopefully I will have an opportunity to photograph one soon. So here's a commonly cultivated plant in our ecological landscapes, plants in the Monarda or bergamot or bee balm genus. And in the eastern United States, the Monarda supports 3 monolectic specialists, including the one bee that I have featured here, Duphoria monardae, which is a type of sweat bee. And if you remember back to my beginning slide, not that many bees in the sweat bee family. I think approximately 4% are specialists. So this is one of a few specialist sweat bees. And it's a fairly tiny, mostly black bee. And again, looking at her foraging behavior, she hangs out way on the end of the flower corolla and collects the pollen that is being offered on the anthers there. So very different foraging behavior than a bumblebee that's going to be inserting its proboscis into the flower corollas and circling around and doing a fairly fast and expedient visit to a monarda flower head. So you have to look a little more closely, but you'll find both the specialist and some other small bees, such as small sweat bees, doing some pollen collection like this out on the ends of the flower corolla. And thistles, it's been a much misaligned or plant. People generally, if you grew up on a farm, thistles were evil. The livestock wouldn't eat them. They're prickly. We unfortunately have a lot of introduced invasive thistles. So up until recently, I think many of us just assumed all thistles were bad. We're learning more and more about our native thistles. The one I have featured here is pasture or field thistle. It's a biennial. It can be grown in gardens, but with the caveat that it can get 6 to 7 feet tall and it's biennial. So maybe not the thistle that you want in your tiny garden by your mailbox. But we have to think about looking more closely at the native thistles, that because they do provide pollen and nectar for a ton of different flower visiting insects, including 2 monolectic and 6 oligolectic specialists. One of the oligolectic specialists I have featured here is a bee, a longhorn bee, a female, Melissodes desponsus, and you'll find her visiting not only thistles but a number of different plants in the aster family. Another commonly cultivated plant, especially in the eastern United States, is Rudbeckia. We have a number of different species, and it's a powerhouse as far as supporting specialists. 26 oligolectic specialists. So generally, it starts blooming now or a little bit earlier, depending on where you live. And if you have an overlap of a number of different Rudbeckia species, you're really going to be providing a long flowering phenology for a number of these different specialists, depending on their phenology, the bee's phenology. 2 examples I have here are the Andrena rudbeckiae, and this is a specialist of Rudbeckia and Retibita, and an example of a oligolectic specialist, Paranthidium jugatorium. And this bee I had never seen or photographed. I knew it was fairly common, but just hadn't found it. And it showed up last year in our corner lot restoration into its 2nd year of seeding. So we had a prolific bloom of black-eyed Susan's Rudbeckia hirta, and this specialist bee was able to find it. And that's when I took that image. All right. If you are growing veggies, you may or may not be familiar with our squash specialist, very entertaining bees. And as you know, squash flowers are quite large. And if you open up a spent squash flower, you may find several of these bees inside, typically the males. And this bee has quite an interesting history. Squash are native to, I believe, the southern U.S. and Central America, sorry. And as squash was cultivated after the last glaciation and humans started to move back north, the squash bee specialist essentially followed the cultivation. So where I live in the upper Midwest, it's a fairly recent arrival on that time frame, and it can thrive very well as long as it has its host plant, squash, or other plants in the Cucurbita genus, including pumpkin and melon. The challenge for this bee is that, like other specialists, it wants to nest very close to its host plant, and it's a ground nesting bee. And the females excavate fairly shallow nests. And one challenge is if they're nesting on the edge of a field where perhaps in a commercial squash production, tilling can really impact their nesting and destroy their nests. So the males spend pretty much most of their time in squash flowers. They're hedging their bets, much like the other males I featured, setting up territory near the host plant. They take it one step further and just hang out in the flowers, knowing that the females will show up at some point in time to collect the pollen. And one recent study actually found that the males were better pollinators than the females because they spend more time than the females in the flowers. All right, if you're familiar with larval host plants for caterpillars, you will know that besides goldenrod, helianthus, or sunflower is a keystone plant. The challenge, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this, many sunflowers can be pretty aggressive. They're rhizomatous, spread quickly, so we don't have a lot of well-behaved helianthus that we can put in small gardens. But if you're managing a larger landscape or have an opportunity to incorporate plants in the sunflower genus, please consider doing so. As you can see, it's one of the particular plant genus that hosts probably some of the most specialists, 35 oligolectic specialists, and this one monolectic specialist that I have featured here, Andrena helianthi. All right, this is a reminder, if you have any questions, we're almost at the end of the presentation, to make sure to include them in the comment box so Penny can gather those together and we can get those answered at the end of the presentation. I'm going to go fairly quickly through the last slides so we have time for questions, but we're getting into autumn, and obviously in many cases where we live in the Eastern or Midwestern, the majority of plants that are occupying the flowering phenology in autumn are either plants in the goldenrod or aster genera, since now we have more than one genus for each of these categories. Goldenrod hosts 37 different oligolectic specialists, including just some examples: the beautiful hairy banded mining bee, Andrena hirticincta. And it's a broader, it's not just goldenrod, it's an Asteraceae specialist, but its phenology is late August into October. So it's generally going to be visiting goldenrods and asters. Same with the eastern spine-shouldered cellophane bee. It's a general or oligolectic Asteraceae specialist. Similarly, asters, Symphyotrichum, Eurybia, all the other fun genera that are now asters support 32 different oligolectic specialists. So if there's anything that you can think about doing is getting at least 2 to 3 different goldenrod and aster species in your landscape. So you're making sure you have a long flowering phenology between mid-August and frost to provide for these numerous specialists. The Andrena nubecula, like the other goldenrod specialists I featured, are Asteraceae specialists, but active in the fall. So they're generally visiting goldenrod and aster flowers, and same with this mining bee. All right, so hopefully, I'm not really driving home this message, but I will now. Native plants do matter. They support 25% of native bees in the eastern US who rely on native plants as their host plants. And not only native bees are dependent on native plants, a number of different insects are specialists. Approximately 90% of caterpillars are specialists. So native plants really do matter if we want to continue to support a diversity of these pollinating insects and insects that are perhaps feeding other organisms in the food web. And here's what you can do. Check the resources that I have on the next slide, and Penny will provide those as well. But the first thing you can do is start planting more specialist plants in your garden and landscape or restoration or wherever you're getting your hands in the dirt. Start figuring out what plants the native plant growers are not producing that support specialists, and start making requests so that we have more of these plants available for sale and they become common and recognized over time and acceptable in some cases. We also need to continue to advocate for the protection of habitat that hosts these rare specialist plants, and as well as diverse bee populations. And have fun, get out there with your camera, contribute to citizen science, start looking for and documenting specialists once you know which plants to look for them. And these are the resources Penny will provide, but another shout out to Jared Fowler, who's doing much of the primary research right now on specialist bees. He's partnering with Sam Droege from the USGS Native Bee Inventory and Monitoring Lab. And Sam regularly posts updates about their research and asking for help for people to look for particular specialists in the regions that they're currently covering. And you can also contribute by being a citizen scientist. If you take any images of bumblebees, you can upload those to Bumblebee Watch. iNaturalist is a platform that you can upload any and all living organisms, and experts there will help you ID what you're finding. So thank you very much. We have at least 5 minutes left for questions. I apologize, I went over a couple of minutes, but I'm more than willing to stay afterward if you want to continue tuning in, and we can get more of those questions answered that you may have submitted. So thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Heather. We have many questions. The first is the willow specialist. Can the sand be damp or does it need to be dry?
For the nesting bee, I take it that's what the question means. Generally, bees don't want to nest in areas that flood. So if the question was relating to where the bee nests, it's going to be in an upland site in a drier conditions. The willow, if that's what the question was meant for, many willows like wet or places where water floods frequently from rainfall events, so they generally like really wet, moist soils. You can push their tolerances a little bit. For example, the pussy willow, you can try growing that in drier conditions and more mesic soil, and it should do okay.
All right, very good. Will scarlet bee balm also support specialist bees?
That's a great question, and I actually meant to research that before we started our presentation today. But because scarlet bee balm is red, it gets fewer visits than the Monarda fistulosa that I showed in the presentation. Bees are red blind, and that's not to say that you won't find bees visiting the scarlet Monarda, but you're going to have less visitation of bees to the red flowers. And I don't have the answer of whether or not the Monarda specialist would visit the Monarda diadema, I think the person maybe was referring to.
Okay. Back to pussy willows for a minute. Will pussy willows survive around a kettle pond that dries up completely in the summer?
It's possible. It really probably depends on the soil type. It may need some supplemental watering, but that is a way that you could get pussy willow incorporated into different conditions than it would be found thriving in a plant community. So it'd be worth trying. The nice thing about willows is they propagate very easily from live stakes. So pruning softwood growth and literally sticking it back in the ground, you're going to get 80 to 85% rooting happening from that. So if you know of a willow population and have permission, you can easily propagate it and try it in different places if you have a large landscape. I'll put that as a caveat.
Good suggestion. Which bees actually carry wet pollen? Are they the ones that chew the stamens? Are they more likely to gather wet pollen?
So yeah, the pollen itself isn't wet. Some bees will combine nectar with the pollen as they're packing it onto their pollen collecting structures. Bumblebees will do this. Remember my orange football image? They will collect the dry pollen and then regurgitate some nectar, pack it onto that pollen basket. So in some of my images, you would probably notice that the pollen looked shiny, and those bees would likely be incorporating some nectar in with the pollen as they're packing it. But other plants produce fairly oily pollens that have a lot of sort of fatty oils. So they may be inherently, less dry than other pollens. So it's really plant by plant is the answer.
Okay.
And bee by that matter.
Okay. If you're growing squash, when is the best time to till to avoid nesting bees?
There is no good time. So the squash bees, like many of our solitary bees, from egg to adult is 12 months. So at any point in time, unless the adults are emerging from a nest in the ground, you're going to have larvae or pupa developing below ground. So tilling is generally discouraged if you want to try and attract squash bees.
All right. What percentage of body weight can females carry pollen?
That really also depends on the pollinating insect. There's been more research on wasps because wasps capture other insects. In many cases, the prey that they capture is just 2 to 3 times the size. One example is the eastern cicada killer wasp. It will capture cicadas that can weigh 2 to 3 times the female wasp, but the females are still able to carry their prey. So similarly with bees, they are able to collect and carry a pretty significant pollen load, but I don't have specifics on what would be their threshold where they couldn't simply lift off the ground.
All right, interesting. We have many comments about your wonderful photographs and many questions about what kind of camera do you use for the close-ups.
Oh, sure, yeah. I have a Nikon SLR and generally use a 105 millimeter lens, which unfortunately requires me to get pretty close to the flower and insect to get a decent photo. I also have a macro flash system, so that provides more light. So that's the setup I use, and many insect photographers have a similar setup. If you don't want to spend a lot of money, I would suggest starting with a higher end point and shoot and use your flash more often than not while photographing pollinating insects. It just provides a little bit more depth of field and better focus. So those would be my recommendations.
All right, very good. What is the best way to document specialist bees that we're seeing, and can they be ID'd well in photos?
Not generally. Many of our bees are very difficult to ID to species level from a photograph. I would start with documenting and photographing if that's of interest, and putting your photographs on iNaturalist, or you could also contact some local researchers if you have photograph specialists that are uncommon, so that they can come and collect, or you can collect some on their behalf and give them to your local bee lab. And that would be a first I think that would be the best way, but just realize that in many cases, if you put photographs of any type of bee on iNaturalist, for example, some or many will only get to genus level in a lot of cases.
All right. Can you remind us what mesic means?
Oh, sorry. Mesic is another term for medium. So medium soil moisture or soil texture, for that matter. Talking about soil type, a loam soil would be mesic, and then soil moisture, medium moisture.
Okay. The deer have eaten my pussy willows. Will they re-sprout?
Oh, absolutely. Willows are pretty tenacious plants and have evolved to have heavy herbivore browsing, so they will regenerate if they're browsed to the ground.
All right. Where should bee houses be stored over the winter, or do they stay where they are?
You can leave them where they are because the bees have already a natural ability to survive the cold and freezing temperatures while they're developing. Typically, they'll go in a suspension of development during the winter, or diapause, and many bees will have a number of strategies to ensure that their tissues don't freeze. So it doesn't really matter if you leave them out in place or put them in a garage. You're still going to get likely a similar survival rate.
Okay, very good. What is the best angle for photographing bees? Back or side?
Yeah, it depends on the genus. Generally try and get at least 3 different shots, a side profile, of photograph of the face or head, top-down view, with trying to key out different bee genera. Each genus has a number of different features that you would be looking for. So the more angles and more shots that you can get of a particular species, the better. And on iNaturalist, for example, you can upload as many photos as you want for a particular observation of the same species. So if you took 20 different angles of a bee, go for it. Put them all up there if they're in focus.
All right. Have you noticed a decline in bees in your area this year?
I can't say. I mean, anecdotally, we definitely have fewer bees, but what I am noticing just from taking some notes is the plants have a much shorter flowering period than they seem to have in the past, but it's all sort of anecdotal, and I can't say I have any particular data that says the bee populations are changing where I live in the last year or two. So,
And is the shortened flowering time because of the heat?
I believe it's because of the heat. We generally in the upper Midwest have a cool transition into summer, and now our springs are very compressed, and then we get into really hot weather. And that could be playing a part of these plants that are normally blooming in the end of May, that are used to cooler nighttime temperatures and not too hot daytime temperatures, are now experiencing 80, 85 degree weather and humidity. So that could be a factor influencing the length of time that they're blooming.
And is the heat or changing climate affecting the quality of pollen, and can bees tell the difference?
There's a study that looked at pollen protein content with climate change, and they looked at herbarium records of Canada goldenrod going back to the 1800s, and there's a strong correlation between rise in CO2 in the atmosphere and a decrease in the pollen protein content in plants, in particular the Canada goldenrod that they were looking at. So there is a concern that the nutritional quality of many of our flowering plants is declining. If bees aren't getting their so-called hamburger from the plants and the amount of provisions that they normally collect, they're not providing a very nutritional food source for their larvae. And you see that seasonally with different weather patterns. So for example, a bee's physical size as an adult is determined by the quantity of food that it's provided and the quality of the food. So sometimes the first generation of bumblebee workers can be quite tiny, and that could be a symptom of a poor number of flowering plants available for the queen to collect the provisions, and it can also be a symptom of the nutritional quality. So that is a real concern with climate change.
Well, that is a concern. Once bees have visited a flower, is the flower empty of pollen and nectar, or does the flower continue to produce pollen and nectar as long as the flower is open?
Yeah, it's really plant specific. So many plants have a cycle of nectar production. It could be a 24-hour cycle where they replenish nectar overnight and then have a full offering in the morning, but by late afternoon, all the nectar has been depleted depending on the frequency of visitation the plant's experiencing. And similarly with pollen, it only has enough energy or resources to produce a certain amount of pollen every day. So here's an example, wild rose, growing smooth wild rose, Rosa blonda in my corner lot restoration. And all of the bee activity on the wild rose is in the morning because that's when the pollen is offered. And by midday, there isn't a single insect visiting those flowers because all the pollen has been collected. So it really is plant specific, but keep that in mind that you'll often see more, depending on temperatures, you'll see more pollinator activity in the morning because of that overnight replenishment of resources.
All right, very good. This listener would like to plant zizia, but has rabbits. Do you know if this is a particular favorite of rabbits?
In my experience, I have not seen rabbits eat zizia. So, but everybody's different. Every deer population is different. But no, I've never seen zizia browsed. One thing to keep in mind, like many native plants, zizia seeds heavily. So if you're planting it in a garden with lots of bare ground around, you will have many, many zizia seedlings. If you're planting it in a densely planted garden like the one in the photo, but in a sunnier location, that will limit the seeding from zizia plants.
All right. This listener took a video of a wool carder bee harvesting wool from a non-native annual in a container. What would the native plant be that these bees would normally harvest wool from?
Yeah, so a number of the wool carders like plants that have very hairy leaves or hairy flower buds. One example is we have a number of spiderwort, Tradescantia native plants that have, or not number, a few, that have hairy flower buds. And I regularly see wool carders carding or collecting the hairs from spiderwort flower buds. Another example is where I live is prairie sage, plant in the Artemisia genus, and they will collect the hairs from that. But we have two introduced, in the eastern US, we have two introduced wool carder species, and they tend to collect the hairs from a wide variety of plants. Lamb's ears is a favorite, for example. So those are some native plants that they will collect from, but generally the wool carders that people are seeing are the two introduced species, not any of the native species.
Okay. This listener lives in a suburban neighborhood with very few surrounding natural areas or gardens. Will specialist bees be able to find her gardens if she plants natives?
Well, I don't have a good answer for that, but I always say that if you plant it, they will come. And I know that sounds silly, but even if you are an isolated patch of habitat, we don't really fully understand native bee dispersal, but have certainly found that in my own experience that planting these native plants, I have had a number of specialists just show up that I'd never seen before, and they weren't present before I put the plants in. So it's obviously very worthwhile trying and finding out.
Okay. This gardener has a neighbor who sprays Telstar bifenthrin and is concerned about drift to her pollinator plants. Would you suggest covering the garden with a tarp when they are spraying to help keep the plants free from this chemical?
Well, generally, anyone with a pesticide license cannot allow for pesticides to drift onto neighboring property. So I would start with that. If it's a homeowner and not a licensed professional, they shouldn't be allowed to have the pesticides they're using on their property coming over onto adjoining properties. That's a good idea, but the challenge with trying to cover plants to protect them is you obviously don't know when the applicator might be out and doing the application. So it's very challenging. I think it starts with a conversation with the neighbor and reminding them of the impacts that spraying may have on your property and that you have a right not to have your property sprayed. So doing so in low wind conditions and all the other strategies that the applicator should be using to limit spray drift. I know that's not a great answer. It's a really, really challenging thing that many of us experience living in neighborhoods.
Thank you. This listener is letting prunella naturalize. What kinds of bees might visit?
Yeah, prunella generally attracts a wide variety of bees. They are typically nectar foraging and not pollen collecting visits. So you're going to find bumblebees, sweat bees, you name it, a pretty wide diversity of native bees visiting prunella. Prunella is being promoted where I live in the Midwest as a bee lawn addition. And so it can take some foot compaction and mowing and still bloom. So that's one way people are utilizing prunella here.
Okay. How deep should the sand be that you're providing for ground nesting bees?
It really depends on the species. So I mentioned the squash bee having shallow nests. They don't necessarily nest in sand, but their nests are 5 inches deep, whereas some of our other ground nesting bees can have pretty extensive and deep nests, 24, 30 inches deep. So I wouldn't worry too much about the soil profile. The bee will pick the site that they preferentially like. And for example, where I live, my home landscape, my house sits on a gravel glacial esker. So we have a pretty deep sand profile that terminates in a clay hardpan. So I have a large diversity of ground nesting bees that don't seem to mind a combination of soil types for nesting. So yeah, I wouldn't try and think about ways to amend or alter soil to attract bees. Just think about not leaving some little areas of bare soil or changing over from wood mulch to more natural materials such as leaf litter. And that's much easier for native ground nesting bees to get underneath the natural loose materials to excavate a nest.
Very good. Does the widespread community mosquito spraying have negative impacts on bees?
Yeah, so there's there either is the municipals or sort of metro-wide spraying under a government entity, or that person may be talking about the private companies that are popping up for homeowners. So the homeowner mosquito spraying, generally the companies are using pyrethrins, which are a natural organic insecticide derived from chrysanthemums. The problem with pyrethrins is they're highly toxic to all insects. So if your neighbor is spraying their yard for mosquitoes, then there's a high likelihood that they're killing all pollinating insects with each application. And generally those companies do applications every 20 to 30 days. They also seem to offer organic options. I have to research that a little bit more, but the organic options that private companies are offering include essential oils. So they're spraying plants, trees, shrubs, basically coating plants in your landscape and it's the smell that likely keeps the mosquitoes out of the yard. So the devil's in the details, unfortunately. Where I live, we have a metropolitan mosquito control. They generally are dropping BT pellets in our wetland. And it's somewhat targeted for mosquito larvae, but it can impact dragonfly larvae depending on the timing. But that's a much safer mosquito control strategy if it's being done by a municipality than drive-by spraying. I believe in most places you can opt out of your municipal or county mosquito control or drive-by spraying. You have to notify them that you want your property opted out.
Okay. Back to ground nesters again. Will all of the willow specialists require sand, or will any nest in clay?
I don't know the answer to that because I'm not familiar with the nesting strategies of all 14 of the specialists. But it's very likely that some of them can tolerate heavier soils because just where their host plant grows. Their host plant is growing in wet conditions. So it's very likely some of them do nest in heavier soils. Another great example I didn't talk about today is the hibiscus bee. And I didn't want to give people the impression that all bees need to nest in sand. Native bees that are ground nesting generally prefer more well-drained soil, whether it's sand, sandy loam soil, essentially soil that's pretty easy to excavate, much like we prefer to garden in those soil conditions. But we do have native bees and even a specialist such as the hibiscus bee that nests in clay. And the way they adapt to that is the females collect water and use the water to moisten the clay to make it softer so they're able to excavate it.
Okay. And if you're in an area with very hard clay, could you just buy a couple of bags of play sand? Would you recommend that strategy?
You could experiment with that. I know some people, for example, who had a sand, trying to think of the name, the sandbox for kids outside, and have found that bees will start nesting in that after their kids grow up, but they still have a sandbox in the backyard. So you could do something like that, provide a supplemental raised bed with sand to see if that would attract a more diverse population of ground nesting bees, particularly if you have clay soil. But that would just be kind of a fun experiment. I don't know how successful that would be.
All right. Back to mosquitoes again. Does the garlic spray that is being recommended as an organic solution, does that bother the bees?
That I don't know, and I get a similar question frequently about like deer repellent sprays, such as liquid fence that have garlic and rotten egg and other smelly things in it. I don't know of any research that has looked at whether a plant sprayed with these repellent, sort of olfactory repellents, can change whether a bee visits the plant or impact a bee in some way. So I don't have an answer.
All right. Can you talk a little bit about cultivars?
Sure. Yeah, there's been a lot of research that sort of looking at visitation differences between cultivars or nativars and straight native plant species. I think I would recommend not doing a lot of cultivars, particularly if you are interested in planting for specialists, because often the cultivars have been selected for a change in flower color, but what we may not understand is whether that plant is producing a similar quality pollen or the same amount of nectar that the straight species would be providing. So some of the research has looked at nectar production and visitation. I think we need some additional research that looks at those floral resources, the quality of them, more specifics on the interaction between the pollinating insect and the plant and what exactly they're doing, whether they're collecting pollen or simply feeding on the nectar. So we have a lot of unknowns at this point. So I generally tell people to stick with the straight species.
Okay. Does your bee book include information about bee hotels and the maintenance? And if not, can you recommend a good resource for how to maintain bee hotels?
Yeah, I did not include information about bee hotels in either of my books, simply because I generally discourage people from putting up bee hotels. They tend to not get maintained properly, and I'm glad this person's asking about maintenance. So it's sort of people have great intentions. I liken it to putting up a nest box for birds, but it may get used 1 year and then the squirrels chew the hole and it gets occupied by flying squirrels and mice and what have you, and the person who put the bird box up forgot to clean it out and maintained it. So that's often what's happening with bee hotels, and many of the bee hotels are providing cavities in a dense arrangement, which would be atypical than a natural situation. So there's a higher propensity for disease transmission because we're stuffing perhaps a box with stems, and these cavity nesting bees generally wouldn't be nesting side by side. So going back to the maintenance question, a number of university bee labs will have fact sheets on the maintenance, but generally you want to consider doing maintenance every 2 years, and maintenance would include replacing the stems, whether you have straw paper tubes or plant stems, pulling them out and putting in new ones every 2 years, so you can help limit the disease transmission.
Okay, very good. Would pesticide labels be helpful to let you know whether or not there will be drift?
Yes, so the thing you want to inquire about, especially if it's not a homeowner, if it's a professional company, the first question to ask is, what is the active ingredient in the pesticide being used? Generally, they are required by law to post a sign stating the date and what pesticide was used. Sometimes people don't do that, so make sure you ask about what the active ingredient is, because a lot of pesticides, of course, have trade names, and that doesn't tell you what is the active ingredient. And it's the active ingredient that will help you research whether or not it has a low or high toxicity to pollinating insects.
Okay. What types of bees visit echinacea?
Oh, many, because it's in the Asteraceae family, has a sort of that arrangement of disc florets in the central cone, pretty shallow access to nectaries. So you're going to find sweat bees, bumblebees, leafcutter bees, you name it. A pretty wide diversity of insects visiting coneflower.
Okay. What is your approach when you're doing restoration sites to select plants that support the widest range of bees?
I generally, so our native plant nurseries where I live have a number of different seed mixes, pre-mixed based on habitat, but they're often more than willing to customize seed mixes. So if you have familiarity with the site and the site conditions and any local plant communities that you're using as a restoration model, oftentimes the people preparing the seed mix are willing to add diversity. So I would determine what you may think may be lacking in a pre-designed seed mix, and then have them add additional species that you think would do well in your restoration.
All right. When trying to leave pithy stems in the yard for bees, to what height should they be trimmed, and at what time of year should they be trimmed?
So I just helped design a graphic about this. Some research out of the University of Minnesota is recommending anywhere between 8 and 20 inches of pithy stem stubble. I generally just say 15 inches. It's easier if you're chopping with a pair of scissors to, everything gets to the same height. You can cut the old flower stock material down anytime in early spring, and that's the ones that still have the flower heads and you've let stay up over the winter. And then in early spring, chop those off. I was actually about a day or two late this year. I was busy doing other things. And one of those bees that likes to nest in pithy stems started emerging. But so the earlier in the spring is fine. And that ensures that you're providing these new cavity opportunities before the native bees come out of their existing nests.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for that, and thank you for this fascinating walk in the garden, Heather. It's been such a delight to learn about all these specialist bees and strategies for how we can invite them into our gardens.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks everyone for tuning in.